Hello, and welcome back to another episode of ATA's Econ Talk, brought to you by ATA. It's in the name, Australian Taxpayers Alliance. This is when Gene and I get together semi-regularly to talk about all things economics and often politics, and in this case, budget. Now, these ones, the way we set these up, these are live, unscripted and interactive. What do I mean live? Well, you know what that means. That means you see all the mistakes live as they come to you. I can't take anything out. You'll see it all happen as it goes down, whether we get it right or wrong. Unscripted, I don't know what Gene's going to say. He doesn't know what I'm going to say. We often agree on a lot of things. We disagree on some, and we never know what we're going to disagree on until we get into the middle of the live stream, which I think makes it more fun. And interactive, which is to say you could be watching us now on YouTube or Twitter or Facebook. This is streaming to all of those platforms. And in all of those platforms, you can be commenting. And if you comment, they will show up on my computer somewhere if I can work out how the technology works. And if they're good comments, we can put them up. Feel free to disagree, argue, ask questions, tell us when we're wrong, and we will try to engage. The idea is to be interactive. So come and join the chat. And if you're really interesting, I can quickly send you the link and you can come and join the live stream. But that's what we're doing here. We are streaming to those platforms, like I said. If you're watching us from there, please like and share now. Please like this video wherever you're watching. Stop, pause, go and press the like button, share it, drag a friend into this room, and go and please like the Australian Taxpayers Alliance on all of those social medias. So that's the introductions. I am one of your hosts, John Humphreys from the ATA, and my co-host, as always, Gene Tunny. Gene, how you doing?
Good, John. How are you? I'm looking forward to talking about the Queensland budget, so hopefully you are too.
Yeah, another day in paradise up here. I got to say, we've spoken about a few of the other budgets so far this year, and the last time we spoke was the Australian budget, and you may remember I started that off by saying that I found that quite boring. I also was pretty unimpressed with the Victorian budget, just in terms of it was hard to keep me awake, but I found this one a bit more interesting. So there's a bit more meat on the bone, a bit more to talk about in this budget, at least.
Oh, it's very interesting. I mean, it's not quite the fiscal disaster that the Victorian budget was, but it's still, there's still enough for us to get stuck into for sure.
Well, speaking of which, can I throw to you now to give us the cliff notes, the outline? What happened yesterday? What did Smiling Miles and Cameron Dick do to us in the budget?
Well,
in the Queensland
yes,
yesterday?
I mean, it's Cameron Dick's day. I mean, he was the star, and I mean, he made it very clear that this is all about the election. The last paragraph of his budget speech is essentially about how, this is our plan for the future. Don't judge us, effectively don't judge us on the last 9 years or whatever it was. This is all about the future, and look at all the great things I'm giving you. I'm giving you 50-cent fares. I'm giving you $1,000 off your electricity bill for that's a credit you get, which will last people a couple of quarters, I suppose. And then there's the temporary cut to rego. I think it's 20% off vehicle registration. And the budget documents, this is the most political budget I have seen in a long time in the presentation. I mean, usually Treasury pushes back on this sort of thing and says, "Oh, look, these we're producing these. We can't be partisan or political, and often the budgets will be very staid and not, they're not. There is a glossy, but generally they try and keep them as non-partisan or as possible. But this budget, it's got cost of living action as a sticker on the front, and then on the back it's got either 50-cent fares, depending on the budget paper. It's 50-cent fares, 20% off your rego, $1,000 off your electricity bill. So it's very political. It's all about the upcoming election, and they're just spending whatever they can to keep in power. They're going into deficit. There's a $2.6 billion operating deficit this year. So that's on the recurrent expenses versus revenue. So they're going to be spending $2.6 billion more than they're getting in. And given the state of the economy, they're not forecasting a recession. They're still forecasting Queensland to grow. This is over 24, 25. They've got this operating deficit, which doesn't make any sense from an economic management perspective. It only makes sense from their political perspective. And John, you know as well as I do, the operating budgets, that doesn't include the net capital spending. And when you add that in, the deficit's over 10 billion. So, really big spending budget. In the ticker along the bottom of the screen, I think you've identified that there's an additional, 5 billion of spending or something. There's a $3 billion plus cost of living package. Yeah, huge, really big spending budget. And look, there are some measures. There's one or two measures I think are quite good. We can talk about them later. But generally, I mean, it's not a budget in the long-term interests of Queenslanders. It's a budget in the short-term interest of the Miles government. John, I can't hear you.
No, that was stupid. I muted myself and then didn't unmute myself. Maybe
I missed your incisive reply or comment. Yes.
Did I sound a lot smarter while I was muted? It could have been. No, but you touched on a couple of points that I've got some of my go-to issues to complain about with every budget, and because I say it every time, it's not new. But please indulge me for 1 minute while I make the same complaint. Down the ticker now, you'll see, just as you said, right? They announced their operating result. Operating deficit of 2.6 billion. They announced an operating surplus for the year just finishing. But as you've probably noticed, the year just finishing, they said, yeah, we had a surplus. Well, in fiscal terms, which is how the federal government and all honest people would report a budget, in fiscal terms, the year just ending was in deficit again. So it wasn't actually in surplus. So this trick that state governments do of focusing on the operating balance instead of the fiscal balance is one of my bugbears. And yeah, 2.6 billion deficit, that sounds small enough. I mean, billions, it's not really that small, but the truth is 10.8, so some 4 times bigger. So that should grab people's attention, except that of course the media doesn't report the fiscal deficit. And my other bugbear, which you mentioned, I hadn't put it on the ticker when you said it, I'll put it on now that I said it, is using their operating balance, 2.6 billion. There's lots of reasons a budget could go into deficit. The reason here, as so often, it's new spending announced in the last year. This isn't spending that's been locked in, right? This isn't keeping the schools open, keeping the hospitals open. This is new discretionary spending, and this isn't tax cuts. This is new discretionary spending just since the last budget of 5 billion just in the year. Right. I mean, their new spending, if you measure it over the forward estimates, which is how the media normally reports it, is 18 billion. But I think the more honest way of reporting it is year by year. So is it 2.6 billion deficit, 5 billion of new spending. Here's the kicker, Gene. I don't know if you noticed this one going through the budget papers. You know, the big popular thing coming out of this budget, there's a few, but one is that everyone's getting $1,000. Every household gets $1,000 bonus. So it's put into your energy account, but it doesn't really matter how you get it. You get $1,000, right? So everyone has $1,000 more to spend, which is like, I'll enjoy having $1,000. I'm sure you will too.
Yeah.
That doesn't show up in the 24-25 budget. They snuck that in the 23-24 budget. So that doesn't even impact this deficit. So you could have that, right? If you really want that $1,000 handout, you could have that in the 23-24 year, and you still would have been able to get this current budget into surplus with just a bit of mild responsible. They could still have spent 2 billion or 1.5, just not 5. So it always blows my mind that every budget comes out, it could have so easily been in surplus if they had just managed to do less, not cut anything. But anyway, those were 2 of my regular bugbears. Now we'll get into more as we go. But before we dive into other topics, I want to invite the guests we have for this show onto the stage. If they're in the background, get ready quickly. Start looking presentable. So we're bringing on Graham Young and Dan Ryan. Graham Young is the Executive Director of the Australian Institute for Progress, and Dan Ryan, the Executive Director of the, have I got this right? National Conservative Institute. Let's see if I can put that up there. There you go. Welcome to the show, gents. Thanks a lot for showing up. Maybe I'll pick the person who's the left on my screen. Graham, thanks for showing up. What was your take on this budget? Did you have a chance to go through the budget papers, and did it make you cry?
Did it make me cry? It made me laugh. I think it was the Courier Mail called it, one of the newspapers called it a clown show. And Judith Sloan, one of our academic advisors, likened the treasurer to someone being at the Ekka, putting a whole lot of goodies in people's show bags. It really wasn't an economic document. It was a political document. And while the treasurer rhetorically asked where David Crisafulli, the opposition leader's plan to pay back debt, the truth is he'll have to have a plan to pay back debt at some stage. So we've got a problem in Queensland and that both sides are sort of mute in terms of what they're going to do to fix the situation up, but it can't go on like this indefinitely, no matter who's in power. In the next 3 to 6 years, they're going to have to make some really hard decisions, and none of us are going to like it. That'll be when I cry.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Graham. And you see that interest bill for the government is creeping up. So that's how it starts impacting the budget. Like all of this debt, like with the government says, oh, we've still got, relative to some other governments, we're not that high, but it does start impacting your budget and your ability to deliver services. And that's when they will have to start making those cuts. So if you look at the interest expense line in the general government sector operating statement, while that was essentially, it was under 2 billion for 23-24, that's going up to 4.8 billion by 27-28. So it's more than doubling, and that's really going to affect the ability of. I don't think this government will get re-elected. I don't think they've got a chance, but it'll affect the next government's ability to deliver a budget for sure.
Can I just half push back just for the sake of hopefully having some disagreement? Look, I agree that this the deficit and debt that we're getting at the moment is bad policy. I do worry sometimes that people with our perspective on economics and politics could fall into the trap of making the argument that debt and deficit is always the biggest boogeyman. I don't want to be too chicken little about it.
Yeah,
I think it really does kind of matter how you got there. Now, I'm frustrated with how we're getting here because we're getting into debt and deficit with really nothing important to show for it. But I could imagine situations where you would be able to tolerate some debt and deficit as being a step forward for the country, depending on how you got there. So that's, I don't know if you agree with that, gents, or whether you're strict.
I've always been in favour of appropriate gearing, and when we bought our first house, we were very highly geared. The risks were low because you had to live somewhere, and repayments were similar to rent. I've invested in business. Don't borrow to some extent, but you don't then load yourself up with debt necessarily and invest in the same businesses and double down on the gearing. And it depends on the situation. One of the problems I've got with debt in this situation is that the government is trying to run the economy too hard. They're being forced as well to run the economy harder than it should be because of the levels of immigration coming in, which are just absurd. But the amount of debt they're taking on is a reflection of the infrastructure spend that they're engaging in, some of which will add to the economy because it's fixing up roads and increasing capacity, which will increase efficiency, etc. A lot of it is being wasted on the so-called energy transition. But it's by straining the resources, by, for example, pulling carpenters, brickies out of the domestic home market into the government's construction, taking resources like concrete, steel, aluminium, and taking it from one market into the other. It's actually contributing to the housing crisis that we're facing at the moment. And it's not just the housing crisis, but that's the most obvious thing where, building costs are up. Who knows in the residential sector, but say in the, they call it the CFMEU tax because that's part of the problem too, that they're spending money through borrowings to finance their mates, in particular unions. The CFMEU tax is worth allegedly about 30% of building costs, sucking labour and materials out of the domestic market and the smaller end of the private end of the market into the government end, could have doubled housing construction costs. So we should borrow too much. We shouldn't borrow for the wrong things too much, and we shouldn't try and make the economy do things it's not capable of doing because we've written a press release and we're going to honour that press release come hell or high water, and we can borrow and you can't. So we're going to make life hell for you and tell you it's for your benefit.
It sounds like we're on a unity ticket in terms of my point about debt potentially being justifiable, just not this debt being justifiable. And also, you brought up a point I was going to come back to later, but I'm glad we touched on it now. One of the issues they're gloating about $107 billion capital project over the next 4 years. I mean, one of the big stings in the tail there is that it drives up the costs of construction, and we're all screaming about house prices. And if you want to do something about house prices, build more houses. Why can't we? Because of the cost of construction. And yet the government steps in and effectively crowds out the house building construction industry with their own construction industry focused on Olympic stadiums and wind farms and the rest of the the unreliable energy.
And John, a refinement on that is that the fact that they're not just crowding us out, they're going to crowd themselves out. There's more government expenditure there than the government can handle efficiently. So we're going to have cost overruns. So it won't be $107 billion. Once you've committed to build a Cross River Rail, you can't get in the middle of it and say, whoa, dear, it's gone up 50%. Sorry, we're just not going to do that anymore. Your boring machines are halfway across the river or whatever. You have to carry through and you have to wear whatever the costs are. And the Olympics is something that, there's $5 billion there that we've committed to. We can't just get out of. So they're guaranteeing that there'll be overruns, cost overruns.
It's one of the inevitabilities in every budget is there will be a cost overrun on the capital side. Indeed, this budget has $3 billion of the increased spending on capital that they're gloating about isn't increased capital. It's just the increased cost of the capital that they'd already announced. So they just factored in that cost overrun for this year, and they'll do it again next year and next year. Let me just interrupt us all to bring in the last person on the panel, Dan Ryan from the National Conservative Institute. Dan, tell us something about this budget that we haven't seen yet.
I just think that it's always the case that state governments never have completely their own fate in their hands because they're tied to national and international factors. But that's never been more apparent than in this one. I mean, why are we dealing with the cost of living crisis? Yes, it's because of different regulations at state level and national level that push things up, but it's predominantly because we've had a massive expansion in monetary policy since 2000, massive fiscal expansion, and also there've been international, foreign wars and stuff, none of which the state has, Queensland state has any control over. So to be charitable, the state was always going to throw money to win an election, but it's almost been put in a position where it's had to tend to these wounds of things going up 20-30% in the last 4 years. Insane policies during COVID by the state government locking things up, but the real fiscal and monetary damage was caused at the national level. So I hope everyone had fun during the COVID times. Now we're all paying for it all. So that's the first major point, and it's hard to take seriously. I mean, great technical analysis by the economics boys, but I think myself and probably the general public as well take it all with a grain of salt because, as you said, immigration figures, the projections that were originally made at the national level were nothing like what panned out. So you can have all these sophisticated discussions about state development plans, and the BCC has these beautiful models about how it can predict where cars will go. And then you dump a whole lot of people on that they supposedly, were never in their models. Obviously, that's going to stuff it up things up. Obviously, that makes it impossible to plan. So, the National Conservative sort of Institute and the movement globally has been concerned predominantly with things like trade, immigration, and foreign policy. And those factors are unfortunately nothing that the Queensland state government has within its power to sort of make changes to in any substantial way. So what to do? Yes, it's cynical vote buying. There was always necessarily going to be some budgetary damage. There was always going to have to be some. The political reality would require some cost of living release, and they've, some of it you can understand. Some of it's just pointless, and some of it is, as governments are, so often do, they commit to promises which are fixed, which increase overall spending, which are going to be locked in perpetuity, but without appreciating that we live in an uncertain world where you're not necessarily going to be guaranteed the revenues to underwrite those promises. And look, it's a weird thing. They had to deal with cost of living problems, but in a way they've also benefited the state government because you get additional stamp duty revenue when housing prices go up. You also get additional coal royalty revenue when inflation runs amok too. So that on the one hand, there's been a stack of new revenue that's come into the state government that we didn't have in previous years. But at the same time, the public at large has had to deal with these cost of living pressures. So that's my super nut summary of the whole thing.
Yes, a stack of new revenue. I think that's certainly true, especially with the coal royalties. They brought in a lot for the last couple of years. And yet somehow the year we're leaving and the year we're going into is still managed to be in a fiscal deficit, which is remarkable. But I do like the point you touched on. Let's play a bit of devil's advocate or steel manning Labor's position here. This stage of the political cycle, and with inflation that was largely not caused by the state government, the idea that they would do something to put money in our pocket seems at least predictable and perhaps boringly normal for the way politics works. And I will say this, the idea of putting $1,000 per family, if the government was going to give us back money somehow, it's not the worst way a state government could. I mean, most of the ways they have chosen to distribute their money involve much more picking winners, biasing towards their friends or biasing towards a certain industry. Just putting money basically in the pockets of people is probably one of the less bad ways of the government wasting our money. Or am I being too generous?
But you are now. I was somewhat charitable to begin with, but they are also massively creating economic damage as well. I mean, they are. I think at least half of the revenue the state government gets is derived from fossil fuel, so-called fossil fuel industries. In their wisdom, they are deciding to effectively smash up those industries, or at least plan to over the next decade, and redesign, because they know best, a whole new industry which has there's no certainty it will succeed or deliver power or royalties or any of these other things that we need to keep the show going. I mean, I know with Graham, I think it was a year or so back, we actually held a forum on what it would mean to Queensland if the coal industry was shut down. And it's a question that's not...
Gene wrote.
That's right. Gene was there. Gene did it. And it was somewhat sort of back on envelope calculations and stuff, albeit with Gene's very good expertise.
Come on.
Well, no, I mean, you have
sophisticated economic model.
Sure, but you have to. But the answer, it's a question that's not asked nearly enough, and again, this very quick summary is it would mean the absolute destruction of so many regional towns. And yet that seems to be, at least if you believe the sloganeering, that's where the Queensland government wants to head. So it's destroying the industry, which is proven to provide at least half the revenues on which we rely. So all those projections about what the debt will look like, at the moment, be prepared to times them by 1,000 in terms of how bad they'll look if we really start to cause the coal.
But Dan, seriously, if we can't trust our bureaucrats and our politicians to fundamentally restructure the entirety of the economy and everything we require for existence, who can we trust? I mean, you have lack of faith, Dan. Lack of faith. I take your point about the energy transition and the some degree the absurdity of pursuing a anti-coal agenda while relying on coal profits to be able to balance their budget. I think that's it's a good. I think we should all get together and dive into the energy transition situation, because unwrapping it can actually take you down lots of long conversations, which are worth having at some stage. It is. Yeah, I don't see too much coming as a response yet either from the opposition on this, so I'm not sure where that'll go. But can I bring you back? Can I bring you, Gene, into the idea of if they were going to sprinkle money from, throw it out of the metaphorical helicopter, as Milton Friedman so aptly described once upon a time, if they were going to distribute money, is $1,000 to each household? Do you think I'm being too generous in saying that's a less bad option than many of the other ones that I could have imagined them doing?
Well, look, I do. I mean, I'm not sure it depends on what the other options are, but I was opposed to that measure. I thought it was excessive. I thought it was obvious vote buying. I take the point from the Treasury that they couldn't really do it. There wouldn't be any way to means test it. I mean, you could just have it limited to pensioners, but then I guess fair enough, there'd be working poor people who may benefit from it. So, look, I understand that that's not ideal either. I just thought it was incredibly excessive and obvious bribe. I was very critical of it at the time, and I wrote a submission to their cost of living hearing about it, saying, how can you actually go ahead with this without presenting what the current state of the budget is? Making all the sort of standard arguments economists and public finance people would make against it. I thought it was a very bad measure. And I mean, Graham Young's here too. Graham wrote a cracking submission, really great submission to the committee on behalf of AIP. So, Graham can talk about what his views are, but my view is that it's, I don't think it was a great idea. Maybe it is better than some other options, but depends on what those other options are, John.
Yeah,
fair enough. Graham, do you want to take us through your submission?
Well, I can't remember it. Thanks, Gene, for the comment. I can't remember all the details of it, but sort of first point to make is that cost of living pressures are a key to getting inflation down. So if you start throwing money at households to help them with the cost of living, it means that interest rates are going to stay up for longer because the Reserve Bank won't have any alternative. The Reserve Bank's basically only got one lever that it can deal with. Well, not quite, but so interest rates will stay up longer. That'll hurt people on mortgages. It'll hurt businesses who've borrowed, and it's sending the wrong signals. The $1,000, it's not $1,000 a household. This household here got $3,300 out of it because multiple properties. Clive Palmer, I think, got $40,000 out of it because of multiple properties. If there was a legitimate way for a state government to buy into this, it'd be, well, we'll freeze our charges for 12 months or something like that, which again is not means tested, but it's a lot more modest than throwing $1,000 at households. But also this sort of, it's not a measure which is actually a cost of living measure because it won't keep going. I think the $1,000, if I remember correctly, was $2.3 billion. You can't keep coughing up $2.3 billion every quarter, basically, to ameliorate the price of electricity. So it really is just an outright bribe. As you pointed out, it's kind of funded by coal royalties. I say kind of because if you're running into deficit, then you're borrowing money as well. You might as well say we're borrowing it. But coal royalties were massive. I think 15 billion year before last, 10 billion this year. They're going down to 5 to 4 billion, which is more the range that you'd expect them to be in historically. So we had this smash and grab tax up to 45%, I think it was, on coal royalties, which is far higher than anyone else in the country and probably in the world charges. And they've instead of putting that like a windfall, like if you won Tats Lotto, what would be the thing you'd do with it first if you were sensible? you'd pay off the house mortgage. You wouldn't go to the kids and say, right, you're all feeling miserable. Let's go on all expenses paid around the world holiday, and we'll leave the mortgage as it is. And in fact, it doesn't quite cover that, so we'll borrow a bit more on the house because house prices are going up. That's what they've done. It's a bit scary because it's a microcosm of what the federal government is doing. We've got extraordinarily good terms of trade. We're running trade surpluses. Like when I grew up, we were in trade deficit all the time. Trade was something you only kind of dreamt of, and getting into balance was really the aim. We've had trade surpluses because terms of trade have been so good. We are so reliant, not just on coal, but even more on iron ore. And the federal government has been ramping up spending from about 23% of GDP. It's going to about 27%. Instead of adjusting their expenditure down, they're putting taxes up to cover that. But a big block of covering that is coming out of mining. So when that goes down, as it will, it's cyclical. The Queensland budget demonstrates. It's very cyclical industry, mining. When it goes down, they're going to have to either add to debt or come after us to cover their spending. If you look at a graph of the state government spending, it's going up as well as a percentage of GDP. So taxes are going to go up. The next government's really going to have to look at decent tax reform, and not these sort of ad hoc, where can we buy a few votes? Let's throw some money at it, tax reform. I mean, serious tax reform, like perhaps, indexing some of these taxes so they don't get out of whack with reality. So, they're giving some land tax back. They're giving some stamp duty back. Stamp duty and land tax should never have been as high on those properties, because when they were put in at those rates, the value of properties was so much lower. Yeah. And we have a land tax regime, which is progressive. So you get you don't have to pay up until 700,000, I think it is now. For that, it cuts in. Well, what that means is if I'm an investor in rental property, I don't get any land tax probably on my first property, but the second property, I'm paying this extra land tax, which then decreases the extra income, the marginal income that I'm going to get, and basically chops my return in half. Well, it effectively means I'm not going to buy a second property. And then you wonder why we've got a rental crisis. So, there's a whole lot of stuff that's been allowed to fester away for these sorts of, on the spur of the moment, who do we need to buy off? Or, we really can't drop that income back because we need it because we've got this other plan over here. It's just
I will take that
mess.
as being thoroughly rebuffed for trying to be generous to the look. You guys may have been able to.
You weren't a steel man; you're a rusty man.
Well, look, you guys probably could have predicted it. I'm not actually a big fan of the policy as a policy. It's a bit more fun if we try to include the other perspective here. And look, I also do think that just handing money to people is better than them going out buying things and handing it to people. So look, I prefer them not to have done it. But
I also think, John, though, that and I'd be interested to hear your views on this actually, but are we really, I'm old enough to remember when economists used to say, inflation is everywhere and always a monetary phenomenon. I mean, are we really saying that these cash giveaways, temporary cash giveaways, are going to have a significant impact on inflation compared to national monetary policy? I'm
so glad you asked that. That was actually going to be, I was trying to choose between two things I was going to segue towards, and that was one of them. And that was going to be, and I knew this would probably end up being a disagreement on here. I don't think this is going to be very inflationary. The reason being,
I agree.
It's my rationale is not one that I think the Labor Party would enjoy. But the reason I don't think deficits are inflationary is I don't think deficits work, due to the old school monetarist arguments about how deficits come from increased government spending in one place. The consequence will be either a decrease in consumption, a decrease in investment, or a decrease in net exports. And so you're playing like whack-a-mole with your national accounts, and it doesn't actually give you any economic boost. And if that's true, which I think mostly is, what it means is deficit spending because it doesn't work, and one of the consequences of it not working is it also doesn't cause inflation because it's not working. So you can't really have it both ways. I mean, I understand people don't have to agree with me on my sort of macroeconomic assessment of it, but if you agree with my macroeconomic assessment that this macroeconomic fiddling and pump priming doesn't work, that also means that it's not putting money into the economy effectively.
I mean, I don't have the figures at my fingertips, but the expansion of monetary policy in Australia alone, let alone the impact of it globally, has been of an order of magnitude bigger in dollar terms than whatever the Queensland government's throwing in the way of cost of living giveaways. So it's just not persuasive in my view to think that this will have any kind of significant inflationary effect, or at least
that's the other point. Is it's just
major driver of it, yeah.
On the raw numbers, a relatively small amount, because it's some people. I saw someone on Sky saying Queensland is they're spending an extra 10 billion, but we make up 10%, 20% of Australia, so you can times it by 5. But you're not timesing it by 5. It's only Queensland spending it, and it's not like we have a Queensland dollar that it's going to inflate. It is the Australian dollar, so it's going to be relative. So, but I know on this issue that that Gene disagrees, because we actually dedicated a whole previous episode of EconChat to us arguing about this. We ended up finding a nice compromise middle after shouting at each other for a while.
We were talking about the federal government, weren't we, John? I think in the case of the state government, Lydia Lynch from The Australian asked me this question yesterday, and I said, look, I mean, it may not have much of an impact, but certainly it's the wrong direction. I mean, I take your point about, this is a $3 billion deficit. We're talking about a $2.5 trillion economy nationally, or whatever it is. This is relatively small compared with that. So maybe it's not going to be a big deal for inflation, but it's the wrong direction. I mean, no government thinks that the solution to inflation is to spend more money, but yet both the federal and state government here have that in mind. They think that's the solution. And so what we've got now is we've got a situation, if we go into a recession or we have a downturn, we're going to spend more money. And if we have an inflation and a cost of living crisis, we're going to spend more money. And it's just going to keep ratcheting up. What are we
absolutely. No, I agree. The narrative coming out of Labor, both at federal and state level, is also wrong and thoroughly dishonest. The idea that we're going to make your energy prices look cheaper, so that'll make CPI look lower. And because CPI looks lower, now we've solved the inflation problem, is such utter transparent bullshit that they're saying that their strategy is to try to trick the RBA, knowing full well they're not going to successfully trick the RBA. So clearly they're just trying to trick us, the listener, because it's such an utterly transparently stupid proposition. But anyway, I do think,
and it's only temporary too. I mean, as soon as they take the subsidy away, it's going to just go back up, right? So it's completely
but I do think the other side is sometimes overcooks the pudding when we say that this is going to cause the inflationary spiral to kick in. I think it's good to critique their policy because it's bad policy, but I don't think it's bad policy specifically for that macroeconomic reason. At least, but Graham, maybe you disagree with us. Feel free.
Yeah, well, I disagree with you. I agree with Gene. I've heard economists argue that voting is a waste of time because the marginal value of your vote is virtually zero, which is a version of the argument you've just put. If everyone took that seriously, then the one person who didn't would determine the result of an election, because they would have the largest marginal value in their vote. Just because you're only a small part of the effect doesn't mean that you're not part of the effect. And all these things add together.
Yeah, I don't know if you've...
For some reason during COVID, all our governments flipped and decided that the solution was centrally planned economies and governments spending money so that none of us would be worse off. And that's now filtered through all the way down to state governments. So you say, we're only 10% of the economy. Well, yeah, maybe that wouldn't matter. Doing exactly the same thing we are. And when they look at this policy up here, there's a good chance some of them down south will say, why shouldn't we do this and why shouldn't we do that? And the next thing you know, it's a kind of salami slicing exercise. It's like Zeno's arrow. Never ever gets to the target, but we know it does. Because just because something has a minuscule effect doesn't mean it doesn't have an effect and isn't important.
So you're cutting in and out a little bit there, but
anyone's arguing it doesn't having some type of effect. It's just that it's not, that clearly there have been decisions in the energy market that have pushed up prices, but I just think in comparison to some of the bigger decisions that have made at the federal level, it's not anywhere. It's not the main. It's not the main kahuna in town. I also think
so
too.
It's a venial sin, not a mortal sin.
Possibly. Since
Sin.
2008, though, right? Like the whole governments around the world have been dealing in a zero interest rate environment. So the cost of issuing debt has just been free to them. And it's only been in the last couple of years when interest rates have been started to go up that they've realized again that there's a cost of money. And I think it will take a while for policymakers to reacquaint themselves with that. Because I could tell, like during that zero interest rate environment, in a way, if they hadn't blown the money on COVID, they would have wanted to blow the money on something else. You could just see people frothing at the bit for massive, big infrastructure projects. We would have built a bridge to New Zealand if COVID or something hadn't come along, because they just wanted to take advantage of it all.
It is a remarkable insight, or insight is probably the wrong word, into the bad time value that politicians seem to have. Because, I mean, we all knew interest rates would go up, but they made their decisions based on the next couple of years where interest rates weren't going up. And on that timeline, their decisions could be maybe rationalized, at least internally. And I think it goes to show that the short timeframes they deal with, which would say is something to do with politics, and maybe also to do with the fact that the people who gravitate towards the top of politics increasingly don't have many kids, and so they're not very good at thinking of the future. But that's a totally different topic, which you'd love, Dan, I know. Before we get into any other one, I just want to push back a little bit. So on Graham's discussion, I think it was Gene and Dan's point is that the spending is relatively small, and I agree with that. My argument was a different one. My argument was just on the nature of the economics. I also don't think Albanese's spending is causing that much inflation, because I just don't think fiscal policy works. Right? I mean, and these are it's two inconsistent things to say that I think fiscal policy doesn't work to pump prime. But if you use fiscal policy, it'll cause the inflation. The only way it can cause the inflation is if it works. So I'm making a different argument here. I'm saying that what I think this government spending is doing is it's artificially pushing down net exports and investment, and therefore artificially pushing down the things that create productivity and long-term screwing our country and driving us towards a low productivity future. That's the cost of this, in my opinion. I don't think the cost of this is that they are successfully pump priming the economy and that's leading to inflation, because I don't think fiscal policy is successful. I am a big believer in the Tony Macon school of macroeconomics, of the small open economy macroeconomics, that says that fiscal policy looks good at buying votes, but doesn't actually work in terms of increasing the amount of money circulating the economy. It just changes where that money goes from productive areas to non-productive areas. And that's why it's a bad thing. So that's my argument. I know it's a bit niche, it's a bit esoteric, but my argument wasn't about the total size of the spend. It was the nature of how
they're certainly spending money on stuff which it can't really be characterized as a cost of living package. And so that's, I think on that we'll have a lot more agreement that all the renewable energies projects and stuff, there's not a great deal of detail in precisely what they're spending that money on, but it's all in the budget, and that is significant numbers, and that will cause misallocation of resources and crowding out of capital and all the good things that you economists like to talk about. So that's something which I think we can have unity of mind on about.
I think we've all probably got a unity of mind in opposing the spending, maybe just for slightly different reasons on a few of the points. Can I go around the table?
So John, just on your inflation point, I think part of the problem is that the Reserve Bank, in common with a lot of reserve banks around the world, underpriced money for so long, which is one reason why our house prices went up. And now the affordability crisis in housing is a combination of the asset prices values being so high and interest rates going at the same time. If they were still down where they were, we wouldn't have quite the crisis that we have. Yeah. But it was just a third that an investment class being money was priced in some countries negative. It was like, we'll pay the bank to store our money for us, which they will then go and lend to someone else at a profit.
That is certainly a unity ticket. Can I say that I wasn't trying to say sorry, you cut in and out a little bit, so I don't know when you've finished. I didn't mean to interrupt, but that's, I didn't mean to say I don't think it's a problem. I guess the implication of my argument is that I 95% blame the RBA. I think a lot of people, for political reasons, they say we have inflation, blame the Premier, blame the Prime Minister. And look, that's a lot of fun. And quite frankly, they deserve a lot of blame for a lot of other things. So I'm not going to cry about them copying blame too much. But I think the blame is overwhelmingly with the monetary authorities. And I think most of the political decisions are like the toppings on the cake. It's not the main part of what's causing the inflation. Can I ask a bit of a segue question? I don't know how I'm segueing this at all. I'll think of a good way to do it afterwards. I asked this in the other budgets, but I think this one's going to be easier to answer, interestingly. But I don't think it's a great budget. I think we're all pretty disappointed at its macroeconomics, the deficits, debt and deficits for no good reason, a bunch of dumb spending, a pretty silly direction. Can I ask you all to find something good to say about the budget? Not like I was saying before, just saying, oh, it's less bad than it could have been. But is there anything actually not just less bad, but actually not bad in the budget? And I have a few, but I think Gene's going to steal them all before I get to them. But let's start with you, Gene. What's good in the budget?
Well, I think the best thing in the budget is that lifting the exemption threshold for stamp duty for first home buyers from 500k to 700k, and then have it taper off over a 700 to 800k range. I think that's really good. It's disappointing that they're paying for it by increasing the stamp duty and land tax surcharge on foreign investors. I think for the reasons the Property Council of Queensland's outlined, that actually could be detrimental to housing supply and the rental market. So I think that's a bit of a negative. But if we ignore that and we just say, yeah, look at the stamp duty, what they're doing there, good stuff. Possibly they should have gone further. Possibly it should be part of a more comprehensive tax reform. I liked what Graham was saying earlier. Eventually, could we move towards land tax as opposed to stamp duty? We could have a discussion about that. But I think the stamp duty measure was a good one. So I'll just leave it there.
Yep. Dan, have you got something nice to say?
That was the obvious one to choose. I think they also reduced car registration fees for about 20%. I actually also am not completely averse to the public transport sort of reduction too. I mean, it's not the end of the world. A lot of other capital cities have, I think Perth, you can travel within a metro zone with for free or very limited. So it offends the purists, but it's not the end of the world, and it's not actually a big fiscal impost as well. And there are capital works projects that they've done and needed to be done that only government can do that, are not highly objectionable. So they're okay. But look, I also, Cameron.
Sorry, Dan, I just have to let you know, after you said that you support the mass subsidy of public transport, I had to change the ticker at the bottom of the screen.
Oh no, but well, you probably misunderstand it. But no, but that's it's not the National Libertarian Institute, so there you go. But they are things. It's amazing to me how in the last couple of years, I mean, Graham Dick has this style, right? It's sort of old, a bit more old Labourish, rightish, seemingly sensible, and so many, like the Greens and everyone, have adopted it as well, as though they feel the pain about the business sector. And it's just you can be putting on that act while at the same time throwing dough around like it's going out of fashion. I don't know. So I guess points for style and delivery I'll give the guy. He seems sensible, even though he's fiscally incontinent in the way
Dan, I thought you might have some appreciation for exactly the thing that Gene was complaining about earlier, where they've increased taxes on foreigners buying and holding land in Queensland.
Well, I have no issue with that.
I thought in terms of something good to say about the budget, I thought that actually might be one of your.
Yeah, I mean, it's at the margins. I mean, it's not. it's 2-3%. It's no big deal in the world. I mean, the devil's in the detail. I think Australian citizens abroad should be able to. Then my brother in Singapore is complaining about that one, but
Graham, something nice to say about the.
I mean, it's if you're concerned about the immigration levels are the biggest thing, not the rounding errors to the stamp duty. If you're looking about, increases, trying to use government measures to reduce housing, that is going to be ineffectual if immigration levels continue at the current rate. So it's a
build a wall at the New South Wales border and make New South Wales pay for it. Can I go to Graham? Something, I don't know if you have something, but is there something else positive to say about this budget?
The worst thing about going last is that all the...
Well, I'm going last, Graham. So it's worse for me.
I did like the idea they were going to cut $3 billion off the cost of the public service over the next 4 years. The only thing I didn't like is the idea that it was apparently going to be done, at least in part, by saving on rental costs, which means that they're going to have to get more of them to work from home, and I don't think that's going to be much of an advantage. It also raises the question, what are they going to do with all that space in the Tower of Power, which they're leasing from the CFMEU? Maybe we could sublease it for our offices. It might be going cheap. I'm going to have to go, guys.
All right. Yeah. Thanks a lot for coming in, Graham.
Yeah. Thanks, Graham. Good on you, mate.
Thanks, guys. Bye.
See you offline.
As Graham said, I'll see you soon.
I have to leave too, guys. See you. Bye.
Okay. See you, Dan.
Dan got out first. All right, Graham, do you want me to kick you out? There, it worked. Only you and me now, Gene, but I did want to say a few things about what we've just been covering off there. We can go a bit more rapid fire now.
Yeah.
The stamp duty increase of the threshold, that's nice and all. The focus is, I guess, for understandable political reasons, the focus of these concessions is on people buying their first house, as in you're a first home buyer.
Yes.
And I think that approach basically says, look, we're just accepting that house prices are high, and what we're doing is trying to help first home buyers get into a expensive housing market. If instead the stamp duty concession was not about you're a first home buyer, but it is about it being a new house, then what you'd be doing is actually putting downward pressure on the costs of housing. Because there's about, I don't know, so I didn't look up the number, but if about 10% of houses sold are new houses, you'd still get the stamp duty on all the old houses. So it's not going to impact the revenue that much on that side. But what it will do is it'll make the new houses seem 10%, whatever, X% more affordable. And if people are choosing between new houses and old houses, it'll force the price of old houses to have to come down to meet the new price, the construction price of the new houses. So I know this is probably less politically feasible to say, look, we're giving the concession not to you if you're a first-time buyer. We're giving it to you if you're buying a new house. And what that does is it lowers the price of constructing and putting a new house on the market, and therefore lowers the equilibrium prices of those houses in general, including old houses on the market. So I'd like to see stamp duty concessions shift to that sort of model, which I think would actually be a policy driving towards lower prices, not just accepting higher prices and trying to help a few people navigate them.
Well, this is what, this is what South Australia is doing. So South Australia has done exactly what you're suggesting. Now, I think they've underestimated the cost of it to the budget. It looked relatively small given the policy, but anyway, we'll see what happens there. You're saying
less revenue for the government, Gene. My heart is breaking.
Oh yeah, I mean, I'm all for that. The problem is they don't cut spending. I mean, if we cut revenue and they cut spending, that's great. Let's reduce the size of government. Unfortunately, they don't tend to do that. But yeah, I'm just thinking about the constraints of it, like whether it's feasible or not. I think it's certainly feasible for Queensland. This government, maybe it had already made up its mind to lift to 700K, and then this South Australian announcement came too late for their budget. I would have thought it was an idea worthy of exploration for the reasons that you said. I mean, let's wait and see what David Crisafulli does. He's got a budget reply speech on Thursday. So, I mean, this is the sort of thing that the opposition should be thinking about, right?
Well, I mean, I can understand why politicians gravitate towards the more politically saleable solution instead of the more effective one. So I don't expect people will be running towards it. But I mean, if people like you and I can start banging the drums so that people talk about it, perhaps it could get on the table. One other thing I want to point out about the current nature of the stamp duty concession, which I think is, maybe it doesn't matter, but I like noticing these things about marginal taxes. So, the stamp duty kicks in at, I think, 1%, and then it goes up to 3.5% as the price of the house goes up, and then 4.5%, and then 5.75%. So it's like a progressive stamp duty that as the house gets more expensive, the marginal cost of the house is a higher tax applied to it. When this concession kicks in, now we've got up to 700,000 has 0%, right? No stamp duty. If you're a first home buyer moving into a home, up to 700,000, it's now 0%, which is great. The thing a few people have noticed, that very few people, I don't know if anyone else has noticed this yet, is that between 700 and 800, the marginal stamp duty, i.e. if the price goes up by an extra 10,000 from 700 to 710, the marginal stamp duty comes in at 21.85%, so 22%.
Yeah.
And now I don't know if that... it'll be interesting to see whether that's actually creates any behavioral changes, whether you see some kinks in the housing market around the 700 and 800,000 mark. But if you were in a negotiation with someone about buying a house and you were looking at 720 to 740, or 720 to 730, so you're looking at, I might have to bid an extra 10,000. Every time you bid an extra 10,000, it's actually 12.2 thousand, because you have to pay 22% stamp duty on all of that marginal extra that you're paying between 700 and 800. So that's of course, as a tax economist, I would look at this stuff and find the quirky marginal impacts.
Yeah.
But I think there might be a better way of doing the concession.
Yeah, look, quite possibly. Yep. But they're working within the constraints of what they've got and what they can, quickly achieve. So that's one of the issues. But yeah, fair point, John. I'm not going to argue with you there.
Another small good thing that came out of this budget is they extended a payroll tax concession for people who hire apprentices, which in a country with far too many of us pointy-headed university graduates and not enough, productive tradies out there, then I think that's a worthy cut to payroll tax as well. One other thing on the spending side, I just had a few little other notes because we can speak a bit more rapid fire. We are coming up to an hour, so we shouldn't go too much longer, but a few other things for you to chew on. The expense budget paper had, I think it was 110, 115 pages of new projects, just new projects in the last 6 months, mind. Not even new projects for the last year, just the last 6 months. About 3 a page. There was over 300 new policy proposals. So this isn't continuing old spending, as you would know, Gene. So for the people at home, this is new policy, new spending policy ideas. 300 over the last half year. Gene, do you want to guess how many of those spending changes was a decrease in spending? What percentage?
Oh, mate, it'd be under 5% for sure. I honestly don't know, but it'd be a low percentage.
Let's say there was 300 spending measures. What? Not a percent then. How many of the spending measures do you think? So 5% would be 15. So less than 15. What do you reckon?
It's probably single figures. But look, I honestly don't know. Can you tell me?
Zero.
Zero.
So this is why it's interesting. The government says we promise to have a plan in the future to eventually save money. By the way, what we've done so far is we had 300 new policies. Every single one of them is well, some of them cost zero, right? So that's nice. So they don't all cost money, but none of them save money. None of them are a decrease in spending. So 0 out of 300, but they promise they will find savings in the potential hypothetical, theoretical future. So it is a remarkable indictment on the philosophy of people who say, well, why don't we just give a bit more trust in government than people like I have? And I can understand the instinct. They say, look, why don't we just try it? Look, the government could just try out this new idea. And if it doesn't work, you could just stop it and do another one. I mean, that is one approach to government, right? An approach that is more trusting than I. But for people who hold that opinion, I ask you to look at this budget. Show me, do you believe every single policy experiment or new policy that's been tried by our state government is right, is working? Because they never get cut. They very, very, very rarely actually get cut, which is the old lesson that if a government project is working, then you need to give it more money. And if the government project isn't working, that's because it doesn't have enough money. So you need to give it more money. And it's very hard to escape this dynamic. So, 0 from 300. So I thought that was a big one. Did you have any other take? I've got a few other little ones here, but just so I don't monopolize the stage.
Not really. I mean, there's something a bit quirky going on with that. Is it the Chermside bypass or whatever it is? There's something the AFR picked up on, and I want to have a closer look at it. There's in their commentary on the Queensland budget, they said that the Queensland government's potentially looking at renationalising some of the toll road assets. So I'm not entirely sure what the AFR is driving at, but there was something in one of the budget measures about a road project whereby they're looking at some of the tolling stations. I have to have a closer look at it, but I think that's worth having a closer look at. There's the Gympie Road bypass, pre-construction works, and they're saying as part of this stage, Queensland Treasury, the Department of Transport and Main Roads and QIC will investigate opportunities to optimise the commercial value of tolling rights on existing SEQ toll roads following the conclusion of existing concessional arrangements. So that's something I think is worth looking at, just what's going on there. This financial review certainly, scratching the head over what that means.
Yeah, well, I haven't looked into that one at all. So if you find out, let's come back and if it's a good story, we'll come back and do another one. Hey, it's a shame I didn't get to talk about this with Graham and Dan, because they've got they're quite interested in the politics. But as a Eugene, I want the politics of this budget. Everyone's talking about Labor's down in the polls, so they give us lots of money so that we like them, so we vote for them, right? That's the politics. I think there could be another more insidious and more like Machiavellian genius political element to this.
Yeah.
Labor's probably going to lose. I think they know they're going to lose. So what they've done is introduced a bunch of policies that expire in the first year of a new Liberal government. And the new Liberal government's going to have to choose to either renew unaffordable spending, blow out the budget, and be bad fiscal managers, or within their first year of coming in as the new government, they're going to have to do something that will be portrayed as and perceived as massive cuts. They're going to be like putting the transport costs up from 50 cents to $5. They're going to be increasing your rego by 25%. This is potentially going to give Labor a lot of sticks to hit an incoming LNP government with in about a year's time, when all of these temporary sugar hits lapse. And it's a little bit evil, but it's I think it's pretty politically smart. I mean, if that's what they're doing.
Yeah, I think it's politically convenient for them. I mean, yeah, maybe they had that at the back of their mind. But look, I mean, let's just be grateful these are just temporary measures. I mean, it would have been much worse if they'd locked them in and they'd left these, adding to that structural deficit. Or, well, actually, I mean, they're claiming that the budget's going to whir back into surplus later on in the forward estimates. We'll see if that actually happens. But look, I mean, I think it's good that they're temporary. So I'd find it hard to get stuck into them over that. Maybe it is a bit Machiavellian. I wouldn't be surprised if it was, but it's actually a good thing that these things are only temporary.
I changed the ticker at the bottom of the screen for you with the quote.
Did you? Oh, okay. Very good. That was very quick.
Yeah, look, I'm not convinced they're all going to be temporary, but it's look. You're right that some of these policies is better temporary than permanent, but I suspect they introduced them knowing full well they weren't going to be permanent. They introduced them with the express purpose of making the Liberals have to look bad by stopping them. The same way the Liberals kind of did this to Labor at the federal level with the LMITO, the low and middle income tax offset. The Liberal Party's policy was always to get rid of LMITO. Indeed, keeping LMITO is probably a bad idea. And they introduced it as a short-term sugar hit to sell the rest of their tax package so that you could give people a bit of money and then wait until the real reform comes through with stage 3. The Liberals were always going to get rid of it. Labor comes in, and then on their watch, it lapses. Yeah. And then all we've heard from Liberal politicians since then is Labor slashed LMITO, Labor butcher tax up. I can't imagine that the Labor Party would be immune to using the same tactics in reverse. It seems like a pretty smart political maneuver if that's what they're doing. So, and I'm not sure if the LNP is going to have the political backbone to stand up to it. I mean, I hope I'm wrong. We've got very little to go on in terms of how we judge them yet. But they haven't given an impression of a huge amount of political courage to do the difficult things that are unpopular at the moment. So
yeah, but I mean, what you think that they might have to continue with the heavy the subsidies of electricity bills. I mean, look, who knows? I mean, look, I honestly don't know. I mean, yeah, politically it could be a challenge for them. Maybe they would have to offer some additional relief to electricity bills. They couldn't do the $1,000 again. I mean, that's just totally
No,
excessive.
the transport costs and the rego fees.
Yeah. Yeah.
If people get used to that, show up and look at their rego fees a year after, they'll see a 25% increase. And there'll be a 25% increase in rego fees under the LNP government. You can't imagine Labor wouldn't mention that.
Yeah. So there are 4-year terms now. So I mean that will mean that it's, maybe they could wear the political cost in the first year, and it's actually better for them if they get the budget back into shape or don't have an irresponsible budget, if they show that they're fiscally sensible and they're also improving service delivery and getting crime down. I'm sure that may be the better approach for them. I mean, I don't know. I'm not a political advisor. It's an interesting hypothesis, though, of yours, John. I must say it is compelling in a way.
It would be smart politics by Labor, but I think the long-term correct response by the LNP would be to have the courage to allow those policies to lapse. Right? They'll take a short-term hit in that first year, but like you say, they got 4 years, and it's really only the first year or two where you can get your budget in order. So I think that would be the smart move, the smart response by the LNP. Indeed, they might want to set the groundwork for that now. Like, just if more people pointed to these tactics so that the voting public saw the tactics wouldn't work as well.
Yeah, exactly.
All right. Well, we've gone past the hour mark. I just chucked up the budget balances down the bottom again so that we can end with the actual conclusion about the budget. Before final thoughts, Gene, is there other topics that I've missed or other?
Well, did we want to respond? We had 2 comments. So thanks, Rick.
Oh, well, this
Matt.
is yes, the question.
Yeah, well, I mean, we've still got they can still tax us, and they've still got the royalty revenue. So for the moment, I mean, they are able to meet the interest repayments. It's it's not quite there's no real risk of default at the moment. So the financial markets will still, or the bond investors, they'll still lend to us. It's just a question of what the terms are. I mean, they expect the Queensland government will be able to pay it, but they'll probably as they get more concerned about the debt, the interest rate, the borrowing rate will increase. So that's how the adjustment will occur. And then I like the other question is, or the other comment, old Argentina, here we come. So yeah, I mean, I
put that one up earlier when we were chatting. Look.
Did you? Yeah.
One of the things about the debt that it's not always factored in. It's not a very interesting point, but I think the feds would bail out states that are in trouble with their debt. So there's 2 parts to that. One is perhaps we need to have this discussion of the federal government, I don't know, legislatively tying their hands as like a kind of a warning to the states. We won't bail you out, or we'll only bail you out with a 2-year delay. So you have to suffer for 2 years first. If they say that, they won't be believed. If there's a way for them to legislatively tie their hands, then maybe that threat would be believed. And then the Queensland bond markets would be an accurate reflection of the state of Queensland's ability to repay their debts. Then the other one is, look, I think at this level of debt, it's perfectly manageable, as you were saying. The issue, and I've said this lots of times when it comes to debt, in Australia, the issue with the debt isn't so much the current level, it's the trajectory.
Yeah.
So if they could just promise me that they would stop at this level of debt, we could hold this amount of debt. I mean, it might not be ideal, but it's not going to be a disaster. We could manage this amount of debt easily. The concern I have is I see no inkling in the eyes of politicians that they're going to magically start being responsible tomorrow. So we seem to be, they know that, we can get away with 30% net debt. So I'll go to 35. Oh, we can get away with 35. So I'll go to 40. And I can't see where that internal political logic has a handbrake other than falling off the cliff. So the trajectory worries me, not the level. The current level, plenty of people would buy Queensland bonds at the current level of debt.
Yeah, you're right about that implicit guarantee that the Commonwealth would bail out the states. And during the financial crisis, the Commonwealth it guaranteed some of the new state borrowings. The states could apply for a guarantee, and there'd be a small fee. But some of Queensland took that up on some of the debt. So I think you're right about there is that view that the Commonwealth would step in. The other point I'd make is that there is such a thing as the Loans Council, or is it the Loan Council, that is supposed to regulate state borrowing. You're supposed to have the Commonwealth and the states agreeing on the amount of borrowing, but that's essentially just a rubber stamp now. There's no real sort of monitoring or enforcement of an overall borrowing limit set by the Commonwealth or agreed with the states. It doesn't really function, but there is a mechanism to actually have that coordination that you may be suggesting, which is the Loan Council.
Yeah, but the Loan Council is a federal. The difficulty with this has to be the government saying they won't bail them out at some stage. So if the Loan Council, that's an arm of the government. The issue there is the believability. Yeah. Because if the government says I'm not bailing you out, and their political interest is to bail you out, we kind of all know they're going to do it. So they can say they're not going to until they're blue in the face. There needs to be something that physically restrains them when they want to bail someone out. So that's tying their hands somehow is the secret sauce in this conversation. I'm not sure exactly how that can be done, or even if it can be done. But
yeah,
I don't know. Loan Council.
I mean, what I was suggesting is that because the Commonwealth is at risk, their balance sheet is at risk because of what states are doing, they should have a say. Arguably, they should have a say in what the states are borrowing. So you don't have Victoria.
Yeah, I worry about that because that's further centralization of the system. So that's the logical conclusion is if we can't get rid of the moral hazard, can't get rid of the moral hazard, then basically you have to revert the decision making to the central government, which is your point. I agree that that's logically consistent. What I'd love to do as a first best scenario, if it's doable, is to try and get rid of the moral hazard so that we don't need to centralize finance further in Canberra, because as you've known, as I often repeat, I am not a fan of centralized political power. So that's my concern there. Which is probably the way it's going, because it's going to be easier to centralize the loan system than it will be to remove moral hazard, because removing moral hazard requires sort of thinking into the future and making brave decisions that aren't always easy in the short term. But
maybe we should come back to this. We'll come back to this on another day, because it's a juicy issue to discuss. No, I probably didn't think about it enough in advance of this conversation. But as usual, the conversation gets very broad, and we go off on all sorts of tangents.
Indeed. So let's bring it back to the Queensland budget for the last 2 minutes. I think I've covered off everything that I came here to say about it. $200 to people with kids playing sport. So, yay for my eldest. Public fares. There is also one other nice little thing about this, that they've frozen rego fees for 12 months. That's an interesting thing to consider here. If let's assume that they're not fully listening to us, but they're like a Hawke Keating style government, what could they have done that would have been a less bad way of distributing the money? I think Graham said it earlier. This freezing government fees. Yeah. That's a pretty good way of letting people keep their money via the government taking less money from us, not via them handing out their money or our taxpayers' money back to us. So this freezing fees idea, it was also a bit of a missed opportunity. I didn't think the Labor government would do this, but if a future government was in this situation where they felt obliged to give cost of living relief, they could have introduced more moderate versions and made them permanent. So I think, for instance, the LNP's response to this rego cut, they got a 20% cut in car rego fees, but it's only for 1 year. I think their response should be to make it 10%, but make it permanent.
Right. Yeah.
So that also rebuts. It looks more responsible because it's a smaller cut, but it's permanent, so it's much better for us long term, and it undercuts the Labor's strategy of trying to force the Liberals to have a rego increase of 25% the next year. Yeah. So that's making these handouts smaller but permanent. Not the handouts. When they're tax cuts, making the tax cuts smaller but permanent would be I think, a good political response to this budget. Anyway, I guess we'll find out the political response tomorrow.
Yeah, well, I think the opposition's essentially said, "Oh, yeah, we're just going to back whatever the government announces." But the thing is,
What do you think of that? What do you think of that, Ian?
I can't understand it, but I'm not a political advisor, so I can't understand it. I think it's been criticised quite heavily by people like Scott Prasser, who's saying they're not really acting like an effective opposition. On the other hand, it is difficult for oppositions to be able to develop policy because they just don't have the resources. So in a way, it's partly understandable, but it probably would be good if they could come up with some alternative policies and offer something different. But I guess they're making the judge.
I've given them two today on this live stream.
You have indeed.
Stamp duty cut. It's the stamp duty cut for new houses, not new home buyers, and the rego cut by a more modest 10%, but make it permanent. So we'll see if anyone's. I doubt they'll be able to rush those into the budget response by tomorrow. In terms of Christofouli's response that he's going to preemptively back the budget, I mean, it seems. I laugh whenever I hear it, but it does occur to me that it's a unicameral system. There is no upper house in Queensland.
Yeah.
Whatever Labor says they'll do in the budget will be done. So it's not like this actually makes any difference. It seems like Christofouli's just saying, I will accept reality. And he's saying it in maybe a silly way, or maybe I don't know if it's politically smart or silly. That's someone else to decide. But the reality is Labor will be able to pass legislation for everything in this budget, guaranteed. And then when the LNP comes in, they will have the opportunity to put down their own budget. And at that point, they can make the changes. So I'm not even sure if Christofouli's really said anything. I don't know if there's any substance in those sentences.
I know he's basically said he'll go along with all of the measures that Labor's announcing. So essentially, it means that if he's to keep his promise, he can't reverse any of the spending, all of those 300 or plus positive measures. He can't go. I think that's a waste of money. I'm going to cut that. And in a way, it's a bit strange because all governments take the opportunity to do that. So when the Rudd government came in, Treasury went through, and Finance and PM&C, we went through a massive exercise where we were reviewing all of the different things that I think it was Greg Smith had identified that these are potential savings, and we went through them all and worked out, okay, these are the ones you actually can cut. There was some analysis of, maybe some of these you can't really cut, or the money's already gone out the door.
The expenditure review, once you get elected, absolutely must be done. But I actually don't interpret Christofouli's preemptive budget commitment here as excluding that. I mean, he's saying this budget. He's going to vote for this budget. So he'll vote for this budget, and next year you can make policy changes. I mean, they make like 300 spending policy changes every budget. So he can make future spending changes. I don't think saying I voted for a previous budget means I can never cut spending ever in the future. I mean, that's...
I'm not, John. I think if you look at what he said and how it's been interpreted and based on his responses to media questions, he is saying he's going to back every measure in the budget. He won't oppose it. He won't oppose 50-cent fees. He's not going to reverse the electricity rebate.
But those are temporary measures. So those are already going to be legislated and already halfway through being done.
Yeah.
The 6 months of cheaper transport will be halfway done by the budget. By the time he's actually sat down and got a briefing from his treasurer and Christmas is over, he'll have 4 days left.
Yeah. I'd go, I think we'd have to get his statement up, but what's really raised eyebrows is the fact that it has been interpreted as him saying he will back every measure, and he won't be able to do that standard exercise that governments do where they just go through all of the silly spending. I mean, if you look at what the Howard government had promised before the Rudd government came in, there was a lack of discipline by them in the last year. I mean, John Howard was essentially approving things outside of the standard budget process. And so there was money for all sorts of different things that, were really excessive. And the Rudd government was able to go, oh, look, that's a waste of money. Why are we giving money to that? I forget, some sailing regatta or something. I can't remember the specifics, but there are all sorts of things that shouldn't have had Commonwealth subsidies, but we're getting Commonwealth money because the Howard government needed to shore up votes in some marginal constituency somewhere. So,
Yeah, and it didn't work.
no,
At least not that year.
no.
Look, I think they'll do that anyway. So I don't think they're going to be. Well, if they're halfway politically smart, they have to do that. I mean, it's the first year after you come in, you have to clear house because that's the only time you have the excuse of saying, "Oh, look how bad the books are. We have to fix it," which is what every government does when they come in. It's inevitable. It's half true, and then they've given themselves the maximum amount of time before the next election. I can't imagine they're not going to do that. And maybe I'm just got a more charitable read on this, but I see him as saying, "I will vote for this legislation that's going to be put in next week. The legislation that is guaranteed to pass anyway, I will just sit there and go, meh. And then after the election, we can start looking at the budget."
So the legislation is just the appropriation bill, isn't it? I mean, it's just the bill that says we need to appropriate 90 billion or whatever it is from the Consolidated Revenue Fund. So his promise is much more than that. His promise is,
there's going to be a series of legislation passed after the appropriations bill for specific measures that are announced in the budget. And he said he won't stand in the way of any of those too. But also he's saying he won't stand in the way. He literally can't. He doesn't have the numbers. So he's saying, I could have stood here and said no and been ignored. Instead, I will stand here and say nothing and be ignored, which, all right, look, maybe it's a politically dumb thing to do. I don't know. It's above my pay grade for the political judgment of that. But I don't know if he's actually said anything that changes anything. So maybe it is political genius and we haven't seen it.
Well, I guess their judgment is that the government is just it will lose because people are concerned about youth crime. People are concerned about housing. Things just, Queensland just seems to be, things aren't going as well as they should be. And I think a lot of people are going to blame, rightly or wrongly, they're going to blame the current state government for it. And, there's that it's time factor as well. So I think, I think the small target strategy is, I mean, it's not just a small target strategy. I think it's just politics now, is you try to take every issue you don't want to fight the election on. You take every other issue off the table. So what's one way of taking every other issue off the table? Just say everything except for crime and cost of living, everything other than that, I agree with the other side. So there's no point arguing. Yeah.
Let's just argue about this space that I want to talk about. So I think that would be smart politics. Yeah. Getting even more into the politics of this then, and a little bit off the budget, what's going to happen in October? What's your prediction for the outcome of the election?
Oh, I think LNP will win quite convincingly.
Do you think it'll be like a 2012 landslide with Labor left with 7 people? Or
no, I don't think it'll be quite like that. But I think they will lose a lot of seats, particularly in regional Queensland. But I can't see a repeat of 2012. I mean, it's hard to believe how that actually happened back then. Although, partly it was because, definitely people were upset with Bligh. They thought there were some broken promises and they thought there was some fiscal mismanagement. But also Campbell Newman was quite compelling. I mean, he looked like a very successful. He was a successful Lord Mayor, and it looked like he had a lot of energy. It looked like he had a lot of vision, and I think that was part of the reason. What history
sometimes obscures from us is that Campbell Newman was seen as a very successful mayor during the time of the floods, when Brisbane was kind of felt at crisis point. And at crisis point, they kind of rallied around the leaders who were willing to stand up and take on a leadership role. And Campbell Newman did that. And I think that gave him a lot of acceptability in the city in a way that a lot of other LNP people have struggled to get. And of course, Campbell then lost that and the city turned against him again 3 years later. But at the time in 2012, that was soon after the floods. And most people would say that Campbell Newman did very well as the Brisbane Lord Mayor during the floods. And then he came from that into the race. So that's...
Yeah. And what do you think, John? I mean, what do you think is going to happen in October?
Yeah, I was thinking there was a chance that it would be a small swing to the LNP and that Labor could get in with the backing of maybe not Labor get in, but the Cataboys could decide. I thought that would be intriguing if the Cataboys got to decide the next premier. It now looks increasingly like the LNP will get it. Look, my guess on this is worth nothing. I just look at the opinion polls and extrapolate just like everyone else does. I don't see anything particularly big turning. I could imagine Labor winning the campaign, but I think the baked in antipathy towards the Labor Party might be so large as even winning the campaign doesn't get them back enough support to get over the line. But I mean, I'm just talking out of my ass here. I mean, this is, which I guess is what everyone does when they look at the polls and give their opinion on a screen. But
yeah, yeah,
it'll
exactly.
be interesting to see. I do hope if the LNP gets in, I do hope they take that opportunity to try and put in allies into the public service. This is a different issue getting us well off track here, but I think right of center parties misunderstand the degree to which most people in the public service do not agree with their agenda and are not going to go above and beyond to help them with their agenda. And so I do think it's incumbent upon right of center parties to try and find leaders for the public service that agree with them, so they're actually proactively trying to help them achieve their agenda. What I'm saying is Gene Tunny for Queensland Treasury Secretary.
I think. Thanks for the vote of confidence, John. Yeah, I might be. I'd probably be too controversial. I'd create too many political issues for them. But anyway, I think it's a nice idea. But I think the issue, the challenge is that the public service. I mean, it's in the public service's interest, in many of the interests of the bureaucrats, for the public service to expand. So the public servants are probably naturally going to be skeptical or fearful of some of the right of centre parties, aren't they? If you think about it from a public choice perspective. So
that's what I'm saying. You have to clear them out. I think, but I'm not saying, I'm not saying sack them all. I'm saying change them, change the leadership.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, I would go with sack them all, but I mean, I know that's not going to happen. So I'm just trying to think of what's more achievable, but can potentially help get through some of the agenda that seems to be constantly stifled. I think there is this sounds a little bit too sort of new right conspiratorial. The alternative to a kind of center right small government sort of right wing agenda, the main enemy of that is often the bureaucracy, not the Labor Party. And it's not that the bureaucracy has taken on Labor's policy. Labor is so successful because they kind of mindlessly take on the bureaucracy policy. So bureaucracy has an internal inertia and an internal logic.
Yeah.
And it has a bunch of things it wants to get done and a bunch of things it thinks is right. And the bureaucrats don't think it because Labor told them to. It's kind of the reverse. Labor gets their policy because the bureaucrats told them to, which is why you see that great alignment and everyone goes, oh, look, they're all just Labor hacks. I would say, no, it's more like Labor are just bureaucrat hacks. But then the Liberals think, oh, we beat Labor. Okay, good. We can get our agenda done. Yeah, but now you have to go up against tens of thousands of very, experienced, well-educated and dedicated people who are extremely hostile to your agenda. And you're assuming because you won one election, you're going to be able to get your policy through. I mean, that the people who want to stop your policy the most are still standing in front of you, pretending to be your friends half the time. So,
yeah, it's a lot of the public service is a big voting block. So it's challenging.
But not really, because they never vote for the LNP. So it's they don't. I mean,
but
well, how many votes they're going to lose?
I don't know. Enough of them must that it swung. I mean, it was a significant factor in, say, the Ashgrove seat where Campbell Newman lost. So
I think he was always going to lose that on the flashback election, but they were getting too far into the weeds there. But look, what I was saying here is not to take all their jobs away. It's to refocus the leadership and the direction of the public service. Start with making sure it's pointed in the same direction you are, which means if there are any bureaucrats who are already naturally inclined towards the LNP, they should like that policy. It basically means increase the power of your voice inside the bureaucracy for people who already agree with the LNP. So that wouldn't turn them off the LNP. If anything, it would be a stronger appeal for them to back them. I mean, it would make people who hate the Liberal Party want to vote against the Liberal Party even stronger, but they only get one vote. So it's...
Yeah, that's a... Yeah, I think, I mean, we'll see what happens. I mean, I'm sure they've got thoughts on what they're going to do with the public service. But one prediction I will make, John, is that the three words we're going to be sick of by the end of the election campaign, it's going to be cut, sack, and sell. That's Cameron Dick's line. So he's just going to be repeating that ad nauseum. If you vote for the LNP, they're going to cut, sack, and sell. So we're just going to hear that ad nauseum until October 26th.
It kind of rolls off the tongue. It's like, is it drop and roll? What is it? Anyway.
Yeah.
We've hit an hour and a half. I think we're going to put a pin in it from here. Once again, Gene, as always, thank you for coming in and chatting with me about the Queensland budget and all manner of other fun things. Thank you to people who stuck around. Please make sure you go and find the Australian Taxpayers Alliance on your social medias, on your YouTubes and Rumble and Facebook and Twitter. Give us a like, give us a follow. You can also find Gene and myself out there. I should update these bios to put our Twitter handles in, Gene, so that people can come and find us. I will do that next time. We will be back again next week for the New South Wales budget. We're continuing our budget series. This budget season, I know, scintillating stuff. And then after that, I think we're going to hopefully continue on these discussions, but we'll be able to start talking about a broader range of topics. But first things first, New South Wales budget next week, same time, same place. I hope you'll join us then. Thank you all. Thank you, Dean.
Okay. Thanks, John. Thanks, everyone, for listening. Bye.